Welcome, everyone. This is Destin Garrick, and you are watching Evolved Masculine Tuesdays. Today, we're talking about American circumcision. You may have noticed over this past week, I've been doing a lot of posts around this subject. I've shared a bit of my own personal history with the subject of circumcision in a pretty intimate manner that many people were very responsive to. I hope that you had perhaps it triggered something for you as well. Sorry, having the weekly audio issue that I haven't figured out how to solve. Okay, so over this past week, I shared that I personally have a probably 15, 16-year journey with my own relationship to circumcision. I was circumcised at 8 days old in a Jewish Brit Milah ritual. So in Jewish tradition, it harkens back to, the Genesis and Abraham being told in his 90s by God to sacrifice his son Isaac on the mount. And then just when he's about to kill his only son, he gets stopped by God and told instead to do what's essentially a ritual sacrifice through a cutting off of the tip of the foreskin. Notice that languaging, the tip of the foreskin. We'll revisit that in a bit. And then that this was to act as the covenant between man or the Jews and God, from which God's side would be to make a great kingdom, or from the Jewish people, from Abraham's descendants, which we continue to this day. Now, historical fact or fiction, I don't know, but how that has changed over the years is certainly an interesting thing to explore. How and why that touches upon like what we do in America, and the fact that as Jews we make up 1%, 3%, no more than that, of American culture, and yet during the time period where I was born, 1978, it's topped 90% of all boys being born were being circumcised, meaning having their foreskin fully amputated shortly after birth. Why did that take over? Why did that become a big part of American society? And those rates have dropped significantly over these past 40 years. But it's still quite a bit, and it's still normalized in American culture. And particularly if you're speaking to people in my age bracket and older, it is so normalized that for many people, even questioning it sets off a firestorm. It is a hot button issue that people have a very strong emotional reaction to. I made a post last week that, is one of those posts that I've made that have created heated response. And I'm all for lively debate, but it's also very telling when there's strong trigger attached. And clearly, this is one of those issues that people can have not only very strong opinions about, but really strong emotions attached to those opinions. And so this past week, a documentary was released by this man, Brendon Marotta, who's our guest today. The documentary is called American Circumcision. And I was really impressed as to how well it was done. I was deeply involved in the intactivist movement during my grad school days, roughly 15 years ago, and studied the issue very, very, very deeply. And it was nailed in this doc. I would say nearly all of the major arguments and explanations around circumcision, as well as what's the pro-circumcision folks arguing were all presented within this documentary. And if you haven't already seen it, circumcisionmovie.com will be giving you more opportunities to we'll be pointing you in that direction repeatedly, but I'm just going to say buy it, watch it, rent it, buy it, watch it. If you don't already know a whole lot, you will by the end of it. Let's put it that way. So with that, I want to bring on my guest today, Mr. Brendon Marotta. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's bring you on and sneeze. So Brendon, you're the director of this documentary, American Circumcision. First of all, how long did it take you to do this?
So I was working on the film for over 6 years, and then there was an extra year where we were just doing festivals and touring with the film.
So 6 years is a long time to dedicate yourself to the subject of circumcision. Why?
I had what one of my interview subjects in the film calls the obsessive epiphany. The obsessive epiphany is the moment when you learn something about an issue that lets you see it for what it actually is, rather than for your own cultural blinders, and start researching everything that there is to look up on the topic. So reading books, searching online, watching videos, and he calls it like the late night research, and virtually everyone who appears in my film has had this moment at some point where they went,
I had that moment myself.
Right, yeah. For me, what prompted it a bit was I went through a period in my life where I was letting go of a lot of old patterns that didn't serve me. Sorry.
Give me one moment. One of our members of our audience, Stephanie, said that she can't hear you very well.
Do I need to move my mic closer? Is that the issue?
Yeah, might be. Try again.
How
Stephanie, please give us your feedback.
Can you hear me?
No, it just seems a little far.
I'm not able to move this closer. Should we switch to the other audio setup that we had earlier?
I think so then.
All right.
Apologies, folks.
Technical difficulties. How does my mic sound now?
It's definitely louder, but now there's a little bit of a
wind noise.
Yeah.
Which do you prefer? Should I go back to the other mic, or?
No, I think we got to work with this. All
right.
It's louder.
Alrighty. Okay. We'll make it work. I'll just come closer. So as I was saying, I went through a period in my life where I was letting go of a lot of old patterns that didn't serve me. I was reading a lot on how events early in your life affect you later. So a lot of stuff on psychology and on trauma. And as I was doing that, I ran across this issue. And every time I did, I just sort of thought, well, there's something I can do about that now. And it really bothered me because I can change my beliefs, I can change my habits, I can change all sorts of things in my life. But this was something I couldn't change, or at least so I thought. And
the fact that you were circumcised.
Right. Yeah. It just seemed like there's nothing you can do about it. So, why think about it, out of sight, out of mind, which I think is the attitude that most Americans take. It's like, well, that's kind of weird and it makes me uncomfortable, so I'm just going to avoid it. But at the time I had a meditation practice, and I was meditating really regularly. And the type of meditation I do is Zazen, Zen meditation. And so I would just sit and be present with whatever feelings or thoughts came up, not pushing them away, not indulging them either. It's just being present with what's there. It's not a type of meditation where you're trying to reach any particular state or manipulate your emotions or thoughts in any way. It's just literally sitting and staring at a wall. And so during that practice, I had the word circumcision come into mind, literally just the word. And I felt this really cold sensation in the body. And I felt all my energy drain down to my belt. And it was this really uncomfortable, cold feeling. And it happened a couple times during this meditation. So I felt like, what was that about? And I figured, I pay attention to what comes up in meditation. So I started researching after that. And one of the first things I ran across was something called foreskin restoration, where men take the remaining skin that they have and stretch it over time. So you have a covering of that part of the body. And it doesn't get the structures of the foreskin back, but it gets some of the form and function. And I thought that's kind of interesting. I'd always heard there was nothing you could do about it, but apparently there's something people are doing about it. So what else?
Yeah, foreskin restoration ended up being my introduction to the circumcision issue as well.
Right.
Again, I shared this in a post last week around coming across the book, The Joy of Uncircumcising, and first being like, what is this?
Right.
Like really did not take it seriously at all. but I also have this inherent curiosity,
Right.
and I consider myself an erotic explorer. I still do, and so it's just like, well, let me just see. But I kind of was testing it to prove it wrong,
Mm,
but I didn't prove it wrong.
right.
I proved it right. Please continue.
Well, I mean, that's what led to the research, is that I thought, okay, well, what else is out there? I started researching everything I could. And that, that led to basically what I was learning. I felt like I had to share this with someone, because it was not knowledge that's commonly known in the American population. And it struck me, this is an issue that affects every man, every partner of a man, every parent and child, in the most personal way possible. And we don't talk about it publicly. And so I felt like that conversation was something that needed to happen. And at the time, I was living in Los Angeles. I was working as a filmmaker. And these are the skills that I have, and that's what I love doing. So that kind of was the natural way to go with it.
Mm. And so I watched this. I watched your film last week, and you sent me an advanced screening copy as well, though I got to it around the same time everybody else did. And I was very, very impressed. Again, I went very deeply into this subject, and like even then, 15 years ago, we as the intactivist movement knew we needed something like this, but it takes 6 years of dedication from somebody who's got these skill sets. And you've done it. And when I watched it, I was just very impressed with the quality of it, the thoroughness of it, the filming quality, the editing quality, the fact that you got interviews from like everyone, everybody who's like just deeply embedded in this issue and has done anything like really significant around it, except for me. That including all of these major pro-circumcision advocates. And well, one, like, did you have any difficulties getting any of these interviews?
Some, but not really. I think that the people who I got interviews with were aware that this issue is controversial, and they either really wanted to put their voice out there on it, or they didn't. Early on in the process, I had there was someone I called up who is both a urologist and a moil, a Jewish ritual circumciser, and I thought, great, we can speak to both those perspectives. And I called him. I started into my, hi, my name is Brendon. I'm a filmmaker. I'm doing a documentary on this. And he was like, no, I don't want to be in it at all. And if you're even, he says, well, are you interviewing those intactivists? And if you're even talking to them, I don't want to be in the film, and I want final edit over everything I'm in. I just was like, I'm not going to make you an executive producer just to do an interview. That's not how this works. But I was a little worried, because I thought, I want to get both sides in the film. I want every perspective to be represented, but I'm worried that certain people aren't going to talk to me if they know that I'm interviewing everyone. So, but at the same time, I want to be honest. So I got a book on documentary filmmaking, and it had a section on ethics and how you inform your interview subjects. And I thought, okay, well, I'll read this and then do what it says. And that book said that you should give your interview subjects informed consent, and then it gave the medical definition of informed consent, which, if you know about this issue, is really not helpful at all, because there's virtually no informed consent given for circumcision. The doctor just says, would you like your child circumcised? And gives no information. He doesn't talk about any of the information you see in our film. He doesn't talk about the fact that this could lead to a botch. He doesn't talk about the sexual impact. He doesn't talk about the pain aspect.
Even that question is a step forward from where it used to be. I mean, particularly during the time period when I was born, like, it was a foregone conclusion.
Right. They would give a blanket consent form.
Like, it was, you have a boy, the expectation is, and we're going to go circumcise him. And quite often the parent wasn't even, really asked. Or I think it was the William Stoll case, which you explained in there. Here, I took some notes around this.
So circumcision consent forms, that only changed because a Jewish couple complained when the child that they had was circumcised in the hospital, and they wanted to do a Jewish ritual circumcision on the 8th day. So it was actually a Jewish couple wanting to circumcise their son that led to them having to get a specific consent form for that. Before, it was a blanket consent form. It was just like, you're having a child at our hospital, do you consent for us to do whatever we think is best? And that included vaccines, that included whatever type of birth you were having. It was just like blanket consent.
So in some ways, this is a little early in this conversation, but we're here. So one of the things that's good notes around is so William Stoll, who is in your film, when he turned 18 years old, he sued the hospital and doctor for his circumcision, and ultimately, won a nice settlement out of it. His mother didn't want him circumcised, from what I understand, yet she signed the consent form that she was given while still under the influence from anesthesia from her cesarean.
Yeah.
Now, this was a particular interest to me because my wife ultimately ended up having a cesarean birth, and she was given her consent forms after they gave her general anesthesia. Like, they gave her general anesthesia before she was out. They gave her the forms. We talk about it. So much of the culture right now, we're having a conversation around consent and what consent means and bodily autonomy. In my opinion, this raises two things. One, this is a perfect time to be having this conversation around circumcision, because this is fundamentally about consent and whose body are we talking about? Whose body, whose rights, as one of the big banners that's been used around the circumcision movement for years now. Notions of bodily autonomy and notions of informed consent. Like, the medical community needs its Me Too moment. It is a foundational piece of where citizens, Americans, I can't really speak of the rest of the world, completely have our sense of autonomy and consent largely ripped away from us. And we just normalize it.
Yeah, there are other issues that people are talking about the consent around doctors with. I mean, it's everything from people doing genital exams on women who are unconscious, people who are given an episiotomy and literally, like, they cut open the woman for the birth without her consent. I mean, there's a whole series of issues that this comes down to. And I think the medical industry is still working in a lot of ways off that 1950s frame of, I'm the doctor, I'm the authority figure, I tell you what to do. And they don't realize that we're living in a much more democratic world where we all have access to the same information they do. And their 20-minute lecture on a particular medical issue 10 years ago in medical school doesn't replace someone's lived experience with that issue.
Yeah, over the course of years or their entire lives. So, what do you see this documentary as helping further open up that conversation, the issues of, I don't know, I mean, we're talking about a lot these days around the notions of patriarchy, and that's really what you just described in regards to the way that our medical system is currently run in the United States. The doctor as the ultimate authority, really often described as having that God complex. They are to hold the all-knowingness, absolute truth, and you as the patient are just to bow down to whatever they say or whatever they're going to do. And our own intelligence, our own ability of sovereignty over our own choices in our own bodies are not, just like, I feel like it's taken a lot of work for me to find my doctors over time that actually trust in my intelligence and my ability to make right choices for myself.
Yeah, I have a number of interview subjects who are very distrustful of doctors after learning about this issue. It seems like the question you're asking is a larger one around consent. and the idea that we have the right to make our own choices about our own bodies, which is what the intactivist movement, it's literally the word intact plus activists for the intact body, is arguing that everyone has the right to make their own choices about their bodies, and to cut off part of someone's body without their consent is a violation of their rights. So they're opposed to male circumcision, they're opposed to female genital cutting, and they're opposed to surgeries on the intersex without their consent. But again, I think a lot of the model that the medical industry has, because of liability. So their focus is not necessarily on the best interests of the patient, because if you start making your own choices and you make a choice that they might not have made, then you might turn around and say, well, you didn't tell me not to do this, so I'm going to sue you. So they just simply put a model in place, this is what we do, and this minimizes liability for us. But again, that's not necessarily in the interest of you as a patient. Mm-hmm. That's more like them trying to avoid lawsuit. And especially in circumcision, if they were to say, this procedure that we have done on the majority of the American population, the majority of American men, for nearly 100 years, is bad and has negative consequences, that would open them up to massive liability. Every circumcised American man would have a potential lawsuit. So I think that's part of the reason they're reluctant to have this conversation, and why their attitude toward it is just, well, let's just not focus on that.
So, I mean, that's pretty major what you just described there, and it's sort of you're basically saying that there's financial incentives for keeping this going. Both, well, you didn't speak to this part, both the financial incentives for the insurance money, et cetera, for doing the circumcisions, which you weren't speaking to, but then also the financial disincentives to actually address this and be like, oh, by the way, we were wrong.
Right. And I think that more than the financial side is the psychological. If they say this, well, what does that mean about them? What does that mean to their reputation? What does that mean to their self-image? I don't know if you've noticed, people don't like admitting they were wrong about something. So
I have noticed.
There's that whole issue as well.
So, I mean, that goes from doctors to parents. I spent a lot of time trying to understand. I was focusing my master's thesis on male circumcision and its effects on male and female sexuality. Full disclosure, I did not complete it, long story. But one of the places that I got disillusioned as I read 25 plus books and like every study that's ever been done that showed, all various sides and explanations, and things that I learned were, wow, if you have an opinion, if you believe something, you can prove it through a study. Right.
There's a friend of mine who likes to joke that the two most common words to precede a lie are studies say. But I do actually think that on this issue, when you get into the research, when we do in the film, I mean, we literally put scientific studies on screen and go through them, there is a story that's presented. And part of the issue is that the biases of researchers do often come into the research, and you can see it in the way that they do things. So for example, a lot of studies on circumcision and sexual sensitivity just test the head of the penis, the sort of mushroom gland's head. And they don't test the inner lining of the foreskin, and they don't test all of those parts. And they say, well, we can't test them on both people, so we're not going to compare that. And they just assume that the head of the penis is where the most sensitivity is, not in the inner lining of the foreskin or the frenulum or the ridge band of the foreskin. And when you test those parts, there's a very different story that's produced, and they're actually the most sensitive parts of the penis. But again,
so just to reiterate, so what you're saying is the inner lining of the foreskin and the frenulum, just the underside of the head where it attaches to the foreskin, are the most sensitive parts of the penis, and those are the parts that are amputated with circumcision.
And yes, and this is what's seen in the Sorrell study, which was published, I think, 1996. And if you're circumcised, you can actually test this on yourself. You could literally run your finger along the shaft of your penis and feel the tissue above the scar line and below the scar line. And I would bet that the tissue above is going to be much more sensitive.
I wonder how much of our audience just whipped it out to test right now.
I know. There's one moment in the film where someone talks about Meissner's corpuscles, which are the fine touch nerve endings, and you have them in the palm of your hand. So if you like run your fingertips along the inside of your hand versus the outside, the inside's much more sensitive. And in that moment in the film, everyone, you see people in the audience, they're like, oh, like, that seems true. It's kind of a funny moment when you're watching from the back of the theater, as I do what I was
So you set out to do, you started this film because you had that obsessive epiphany, that moment of realizing, holy crap, there's something here, there's something major here, and I need to learn everything that I can about this. So clearly you went into this film with a strong opinion, and yet you speak of it as a desire to really show all sides, let the audience really hear everything that's there and make decisions for themselves. Do you believe that you were successful with that intent?
I feel like I was. I think that, I mean, on one hand, it's up to the audience, right? But my goal, it'd be really easy to take the parts of an interview subject where they stutter or they kind of misspeak or the sort of gotcha moments. And I made a very deliberate choice not to do that with any interview subject, but to try to present the best arguments that they had. And my thinking there is, if I sort of cherry pick, or if I only show one side, it's very easy to say, well, you didn't address this argument, you didn't address that, and so we can just dismiss what you've said. But if you take the very best of it and put the very best of one side against the very best of another, then it's a lot harder to dismiss. And every belief or argument or perspective someone might have, they'll feel like, oh, you acknowledge that. And actually, if you look at the research on education, if you don't address someone's misconceptions, they keep those misconceptions, but they keep them stronger. So they're like, well, I watched a documentary on that, and so I must know more, but I still have these misconceptions, and so now those misconceptions are stronger because my confidence in my opinion is stronger. So you actually have to address all of those things if you're trying to educate someone on something. And that's true, by the way. This is from research on science education, where you're educating people on things that are undisputed science, like the second law of thermodynamics. Like this is even true on research around things like that. So, and I think that that's really important too, for people who are trying to start a dialogue on anything, that you actually do have to acknowledge what the other people involved are saying.
I would like to see more of that, quite honestly, especially in American politics.
Right.
So this show is The Evolved Masculine. We focus particularly around men's relationship to what it means to be a man in the 21st century, his relationship to, like, what does masculinity mean? We explore sexuality and how do we form healthy relationships to our sexuality, given that we're having really strong mirrors today, that maybe a lot of our programming around sex is not very helpful. And as well as how we relate to women and the feminine. And it seems to me that circumcision touches all of this.
Yeah, it is every identity level issue. It is sex, politics, and religion, all in the most personal way possible. So
let's go through this piece by piece. How do you believe that circumcision affects men's identity as a man?
That's going to be slightly different for each man. And it's really hard to, I mean, even psychological research on this issue, when you talk about that there's this sort of traumatic experience in early life, and does that affect people later in life? People have a hard time proving that around things that we all intuitively understand have an impact later in life. So people who have early life sexual abuse, where there's an adult who's abusing them, we all sort of understand intuitively that those people have issues later in life because of that, and trauma that they're going to have to heal and deal with. But it's actually even hard to prove that in scientific research. They can show correlations, but they can't really Every person's life experience is different. You can't do a double-blind study where like one group has this experience and one group doesn't, and they have exactly the same life path and experience, and so it's hard to get any kind of really concrete scientific data on it. But
this is really key what you're speaking to now. Please continue.
Well, I mean, so what I'm going to talk about is what interview subjects and people I've talked to have self-reported in their own emotions and feelings. And I think that that's important, just as that sort of caveat, because people will immediately say, well, you can't prove that, you can't, but you also can't prove that, rape survivors have higher incidence of certain things. Yet at the same time, I think we sort of intuitively understand there's issues that come from that. So I preface it that way so that people don't think that I am overstepping the claims of what is provable, but at the same time, just because you don't have a scientific study showing it doesn't mean that it isn't true.
I feel like you did a really fantastic job making that explanation, especially because it's an area that I am personally very interested in and speak to quite a bit. We're having a cultural moment around how widespread sexual assault, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment are in this country. And clearly we have ways to go, but it is a huge step compared to just blanket denial. And we've been in large-scale denial around circumcision being an issue at all. When I was a hardcore intactivist, one of the things I would hear from people is like, with all the things that are going on in the world, like, why are you talking about this? Like this little thing, it's not a big deal.
Right. So, yeah. The mainstream framing of circumcision is that it's a one-time decision the parent makes, and then you never think about it again. As if you can alter someone's body and they won't have feelings about that. As if we like don't have a self-image of our own bodies and feelings about every aspect of it, or feelings about our sexuality. So when we talk about the psychological impact of circumcision and the impact on men and masculinity, we're talking about primarily two things. There's what the infant experiences at that moment and the pain that it experiences, which actually there are scientific studies, and this part, even the most pro-circumcision voice in my film acknowledges, there are studies indicating that pain can be remembered and has a lasting change on behavior, which again, that's really important. That this is one of the few things we actually can prove is that, they did a study where they noticed that one group of infants being vaccinated later had a much more intense reaction to the pain. And they were trying to figure out what the common denominator was. And what they found is that infants who were circumcised reacted much stronger to pain. And the researchers attributed this to post-traumatic stress, PTSD. So the infant had a really painful experience shortly after birth when they were circumcised. And circumcision in America has often been done without anesthesia. So up until the mid-'80s, infants were circumcised without anesthesia. It was basically thought that infants don't remember pain or don't feel pain. This is what doctors actually said. And again, this is like, we all kind of know babies feel pain. And like, if you hurt a baby because you think they're not going to remember it, like, that's bad. Don't do that. But again, like, they're like, well, we don't have a study that shows that, so it's fine. We can just literally saw into an infant's genitals and use no anesthesia, and he screams out in pain. So much so that some infants actually damage their eardrums because they're screaming so hard. That's totally fine. So yeah, that actually was one of the other things that I initially learned, is that they didn't use anesthesia, because I'm aware of how smaller things can really deeply impact someone later in life. So things like being abandoned by a parent, or not being held. I mean, there are actually infants who die because they're not held when they're young. But we're supposed to believe that holding someone down and cutting into their genitals with no anesthesia is somehow not going to have any psychological impact later in life. When again, like, this is one of the few things we have studies that show that there is.
And then what is the impact when you do that to the vast majority of your male population of a society? So
right.
Individual, and then there's the large scale cultural.
So there are some activists who will make the argument that basically a lot of the psychology that men in American society have towards sexuality and towards women and towards that entire area of life is influenced by this early life experience. And some will even take it so far as to say that if you look at the cultures that are practicing this worldwide, Americans, Jews, and Muslims, these are also the cultures that have the most negative attitudes towards women and are the source of a lot of conflict in the world. But again, that's a bold claim that I don't know that I could prove with a study. There's also huge cultural differences. There's huge differences in how they're raised. It's not a one-to-one correlation, even if that is true.
Yeah. So for our audience, Jews, Muslims, and Americans are basically the primary circumcising cultures in the world. Outside of that, the vast majority of the world doesn't circumcise their boys.
Right.
So it is far less prevalent on a global scale than many Americans really realize or recognize.
Right. There's an assumption among Americans that this is normal and everyone does it. And I think that just comes from the fact that, we're not examining each other's bodies from around the world, or at least most people aren't.
Do you know what circumcision rates are globally?
Globally, I think it's around 30%.
And I know like some 70% of that are Muslims.
Yeah, that's the largest circumcising group. And in Islam, circumcision is done as a coming of age ceremony most often. So it's done when the boy is like 6 or 7. And so it's a slightly different impact. But again, there are men in that culture that also report some similar feelings to intactivists and American men. And that sort of brings to the second piece of when we talk about the psychological impact. There's what the baby experiences, which studies show does have a lasting impact. And then there's what the man experiences when he finds out. Totally. So if you're an adult or a young child and you find out that your parents paid someone to hold you down and cut off part of your body, or that there was a sexual experience or part of your body that you could have had but didn't, there's going to be feelings associated with that. And among men who are aware of it, there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of anger, there's a feeling of loss. I mean, if you were to wake up one day and any other part of your body was gone, you'd have feelings about it, right? And just because it was done when you were young, when you were too young to be cognizant of or remember what's happening, or verbally protest in spoken language, doesn't mean that there aren't going to be feelings later on. And I think that those feelings are compounded by the fact that they're not acknowledged by the wider culture. So if you have a feeling or a grief and you talk to someone and they invalidate your feelings, and they say, that's wrong, you're not allowed to feel that way, I'm fine with it, like you're not allowed to not be fine with it, then there's going to be feelings on top of that of like not being received and not being able to connect and not being acknowledged.
Totally. It's people will say to me sometimes about how I don't know, I'm bold or courageous, whatever, for putting out all the like my truths or beliefs, whether or not, even when I get all sorts of pushback. And I think that my time as an intactivist helped inoculate me in that direction. Because,
right.
Yeah, when I was like on campus at San Francisco State University and putting a table out and talking to people walking up, random people about circumcision, I would get so much pushback. I would get so many people who would make ad hominem attacks about me and what this, my thoughts or feelings on this are silly, ridiculous. So now again, I think that this has been shifting over that time, but I don't know. I still feel that you got to develop a certain thickness of skin in that regard.
This issue does break all the taboos. I mean, once you've talked about it, then everything else is, it seems a little easier to talk about.
So what do you say about the men, though? Like, they're in the threads that I've been posting around this, they're invariably, aside from the women, that's a different conversation, right, but many men who are like, I'm circumcised and I'm fine. Or even, I'm circumcised and I'm grateful to my parents for having done so. What's that about? And what do you say to that?
I would be curious, what about their foreskin displeased them? I mean, that's a reframing of the question, right? Because the assumption is that circumcision is standard And I'm glad that my parents did what was standard, as opposed to that something about my foreskin was wrong and needed to be removed, which is sort of the underlying belief there, that men are somehow born wrong and in need of fixing in some way.
Which that itself is a real, like we were speaking about the bold claims.
Right.
That itself is a hugely bold claim. This notion that boys are born inherently defective, and
that male sexuality is inherently bad in some way.
There you go.
Altering. Yeah.
So let's speak to that for those who aren't familiar to that. You know, that is a core part of American circumcision, particularly. Can you share on that?
I actually want to jump back to the, you know, there's a lot of men who say, I'm fine, I don't have any problem with my circumcision. And I notice among that group, there is an unwillingness to learn new information about the topic. And the things in my life that I'm fine with, I'm also fine learning more about. Like I am fine with the foods that I'm eating, but I'm not going to be resistant to, you know, learning more about that. And so I don't know that you can be fine with something and afraid to talk about it. That brings in
something else I want to speak with you about. So last Wednesday or Thursday, I posted on Facebook, "Are intact / uncircumcised men better lovers? ? Did circumcision affect your sex life?" Firestorm!
Right.
Including people blasting, saying like, "How dare you, frame things in this way? Like this is a shitty question. You're body shaming men who don't have a choice about, what, the way that they are, and on and on." And like, I sat with this quite a bit, and I really landed in the way that you just described. If you really are fine, then asking a question like this isn't triggering. It's just, no, I don't think that intact men are better lovers. I don't really believe that circumcision affected my sex life, or actually I think that it's affected my sex life in these positive ways because of the A, B, and C. If you're fine, you'd be able to have that kind of grounded, rational response. So
right.
It strikes me with that strong emotional, that there's a trigger there.
Well, I mean, like, this is an area where men derive a lot of their self-esteem and self-image. So to suggest in some way that something about your self-image is bad or could, incomplete is really triggering for men. And I understand where that is coming from. And I also understand why it's triggering, because it's like, well, there's nothing I can do about that, which again,
but this is where I was just like, you know what? Well, a lot of people were triggered by that, and this is part of me is like, great, you know what? Good. I'm glad you were fucking triggered, because as men, if this is gonna change, if this is really gonna change, and if we're not gonna do it again, we as men, we need to have a reckoning. We need to have a real reckoning around the circumcision issue, especially those of us who have been circumcised. Like, this was fucked up. This was mass trauma. Notice I am not mincing my words here. This is mass trauma that we have experienced, and until there's a willingness to be eyes open on that, like we've had an epidemic of what we'll call consent violations, sexual assault, trauma, etc., and where nearly every woman I have ever met that I've gotten into this conversation with has ultimately shared with me about their sexual trauma that they've experienced in their lives. So we are having a reckoning, finally, in our culture that's been a very, very, very long time in the making, and it is that reckoning that is allowing the change to finally really occur. It is not happening overnight, and it's massively messy, but a reckoning is occurring. We need to have that reckoning, and part of that reckoning involves, get riled up, have emotional feelings come up. And if I can be a little poke in there to disturb the comfortable and get you into a place of like, great. Maybe that was the first crack in, just coming to terms. Okay. There's my little rant. Go on.
Oh no, do not apologize for that. That was great. One of my interview subjects makes a really good point later on in the film, which is she says that whatever you might teach a man later in life, you might teach him that it is his role to ask for consent, to be respectful of women, to not take what he wants, but to wait for it to be given, that on some level, he knows that in the earliest part of his life, someone did that to him. Someone decided what part of his body he got to keep. And they were able to do that because they were bigger and stronger than he was. And so the lesson taught to men from day one, in their first...
Literally for most men, day one.
Day one, in their first relationship with a woman, their relationship to their mother, that if you're bigger and stronger than someone else, you get to do what you want to their body. Which is a powerful lesson.
So, I mean, that's something that continues on. It's not relegated solely to the circumcision issue. Like as parents, though, don't we need to make decisions that are in our belief in the best interest of our child?
Yeah, that is the sort of go-to pro-circumcision argument. It's like, well, parents make decisions for their children all the time. This is just another decision. And even if you accept that frame, which most people don't with their daughters, you couldn't say, well, I just thought female circumcision looked better. It was more aesthetically pleasing. It's healthier. It's cleaner. I think she'll have a better sex life with that. So we're going to just chop that part of the body off, right? No one would accept that decision with their daughter. So we understand that parents do not own their children. They are their guardians. Their job is to protect their child's interests, not necessarily impose their will on their children. And even if you were to accept that argument, then you have to demonstrate that circumcision is actually in a man's best interest, which, the majority of men who grow up and are intact and keep that part of the body do not ever need a circumcision and do not ever choose to get circumcised. And, if you talk to European men, they would be horrified to have that happen to them. So this idea that parents make decisions for their children so they can make any decision for their child, even ones which involve removing parts of their body and might go against their child's best interests, is like a really huge leap.
So part of the actually foundational phrase of the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take on is first do no harm. And then I kind of view as related to that is this notion of minimal invasive action, I think is the phrasing around it. So
Right.
this idea that what is the least that needs to be done in order to have the effect that is being desired. Or so all these things that have been that are currently being put out on the pro-circumcision argument, it seems to me that it violates both of these dictums. First, do no harm. If you're amputating a part of a person's body, a part of his penis, not sure that follows as first, do no harm. And as far as being minimally invasive, if your reasoning is cleanliness or your reasoning is decreased likelihood of UTIs, or even your reasoning is possible protectiveness against HIV, is amputation the minimally invasive means of getting what you're saying you're going for?
And it's interesting when you talk, the member of the latest American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement, who I talked to in the film, one of the things that he says that most of the medical claims are a wash and not enough reason to do it, and that it is primarily the cultural benefits why the AAP says the benefits outweigh the risks, which is strange because I think most people, when they hear benefits outweigh the risks from the AAP, they think that's a medical statement, but it's actually cultural in his phrasing. It's just like, this is something that the culture does, and certain tribes and social groups want to do it, so they should be allowed to do it. And so now even medical groups that practice circumcision are starting to acknowledge, yeah, those, supposed medical benefits aren't quite enough. And there are still some groups that are pushing that narrative, but it's really died down in the last 5 years.
That's great. That's a great step forward. What are your hopes as far as the ultimate impact of your film?
My goal from the very beginning was to have something that you could give to someone and take them from knowing nothing about this issue to an expert in under 2 hours. So my goal with it is just to give people the information, and then also to, I feel like that in order to explore your feelings around an issue, you first need to understand it. And one of the things that one of our interview subjects talks about is that men's perspective on circumcision is really influenced by how much information they have on it. And people who don't know how large the foreskin is, who don't have information on what this body part actually is, tend to think, well, it's fine. I mean, there's even in the opening film, there's one guy who comes up to a protester and says, does circumcision involve cutting or removing something? I thought it was just an incision. And this is like a man in his 60s who doesn't know his sexuality and his body that much, that he doesn't even know that there's a part that's removed. So my goal with the film is to give people that information and then allow them to explore the feelings they might have about that. And how far that goes and how far that reaches is in some ways beyond my control. I'm obviously doing everything I can to make it go as far as possible, but I feel like that's pretty much it. It's just to allow people to have the conversation and start opening their minds to the issue.
Yeah. I'm curious, the pro-circumcision advocates that you put into the film, how have they responded to the completed film?
I haven't heard a lot from them, to be honest. And I think that there is a general desire from pro-circumcision groups to ignore the intactivist movement and pretend like it doesn't exist, because there isn't, they're not that media aware. So for example, there's a talk coming up at the next American Academy of Pediatrics conference that refers to intactivist and protest groups as trolls, and talks about how do we handle these, online trolls. And they don't realize that this is an organized human rights movement. It's not, it's not like a few, they're sort of in their own bubble in a weird way. Like one of the people I interviewed on the pro-circumcision side, he doesn't have social media. He spends most of his life on like a 5-minute commute through a Jewish neighborhood to the building where he works. And like they're just not that aware that there's this larger cultural conversation happening that could affect them. And yeah.
So speaking of, one of the arguments that comes up is this notion that those who are fighting against circumcision are really just doing it as a bludgeon point, as an expression of their anti-Semitism, essentially. And I'll also say that even when I was doing my hardcore intactivism, some Jews said that it was proof that I was a self-hating Jew. What are your thoughts or responses to this?
Right. So the argument is that people want Jewish children to grow up safe and happy and loved because they really hate Jews. I mean, when you frame it that way, it's a little absurd. And I understand why someone might think that if they know nothing about the issue. But in the intactivist movement, I mean, there is a significant Jewish representation, far more than the general population.
There's significant Jewish representation.
Yeah, right. I mean, 25% of my cast is Jewish. So I feel like that is just an ad hominem to dismiss the issue, because they're not willing to argue the merits of it. And even if you say that this practice, which 98% of cases in America are not religious and have nothing to do with Judaism. Even if you're going to try to say that this is like, you know, only Jewish, then why is someone else's religion and practice on so many American men's bodies? I mean, I actually feel like that argument is in some way self-defeating. Like they're saying this is, you know, they're in some way like taking credit for the whole issue, when actually the majority of circumcision in America is not religious. I mean, even if you circumcise a Jewish child, that does not count as a religious circumcision unless it's done on the 8th day with certain prayers and religious practices. But I just feel like it's a way, you know,
Jews are circumcised. Quite a few Jews are circumcised in a hospital outside of that bris type of environment.
You know, I went to a conference for activists, and there was a Jewish activist there who was talking about how they'll tell Jewish men like him that he has to be circumcised in order to be Jewish, and that's why we have to keep this practice up. But when he as a Jewish man says, I didn't like this, I didn't consent to this, they say, well, you're not really Jewish. But he's had to pay the entry fee, so to speak. So there's this weird double standard that happens of, it's like almost like a no true Scotsman argument of like, well, you're really only actually Jewish unless you agree with everything that we want to say, not all of the traditional, you know, like not just because you're actually Jewish, essentially.
I remember, so I was raised Jewish, somewhat secular household, but grandmother was an Austrian Jewish Holocaust survivor that was put into me from a very young age. Loads and loads and loads of Holocaust related stories, books, films, personal stories, and bar mitzvah, and then another 2 years of going to synagogue and Jewish schooling following bar mitzvah. And I was really into it. Like I was very into my faith. Somewhere around 15 years old, I started to have a crisis of faith. And when I spoke to my rabbi about my crisis of faith, I actually felt really affirmed by him of like, this is good. Like it's good to question it all. It's well, for one, the only way, I think he just said to me that the only way to find a true, deep, and lasting faith is to come to a place of deeply questioning everything. And I mean, you know, that was 25 years ago. I still really appreciate him for that. And that to me is, I mean, that's part of our larger things around, I mean, we speak about religious freedom, but then we raise children from, I mean, things have been changing in various ways, but we raise children from, you're born Christian, you're born Islamic, you're born Jewish, like that is what you are because you were born in. Within Jewish tradition, very particularly, that it's matrilineal. You are Jewish if your mother is Jewish, period. Yeah. So it's, where is our, we have the ability in adulthood to turn, does that fit? Is that what I, you know, how I want to practice and believe throughout my life? But then when circumcision is, there's a permanent mark on my body. There's a permanent amputation of flesh on my genitals, and the very, you know, the very thing that outwardly identifies me as a man, quote unquote, that I can change my belief systems, but that's been done.
Right. One of my interview subjects makes the same argument, that circumcision is in some way a violation of religious freedom. That, you know, a Christian does not have the right to tattoo a cross on their child. A Muslim person does not have the right to circumcise their daughter. Yet we somehow have this idea that you can, you know, they'll say that this is a religious symbol for them, and then they'll say, well, we have the right to carve our religious symbol into children's bodies. I mean, there is a sense in which this takes away religious freedom. And I actually know a lot of people who left their faith because of this issue, because they just said, I can't believe in anything that says that this was okay to happen to me.
Yeah, I understand that. So I want to go through some of these comments, because there have been quite a few while we've been on here, and give you an opportunity to respond to them.
Sure.
Marcy Javril Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, though I very much recognize you. So glad to know that there's an actual documentary on this very important issue. In my opinion, it's genital mutilation. Unnecessary, arcane, torturous, and especially the way it is done in traditional births. Very disturbing. Very disturbing for the contemporary world we think we live in. I was on labor and delivery team member for my massage client and attended the only births I've been at, and I will never, ever go to one again. She nearly broke my hand while she held it during the baby screaming. How is this still okay? There's not necessarily a question in there other than the how is this still okay, which might be rhetorical. Did you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Things continue until you bring awareness to them.
Yeah, and that's what you're doing with this film.
And I feel like there's a lot of things that we are wondering how they went on so long. And I think that in the case of most of them, it's because we didn't have the ability to spread awareness of them up until now. The media and means of communication that existed were in a very small group of centralized hands. And now we can all talk about it. And we can talk to each other and say, oh, that you felt the same way. I didn't know. I think that's especially true of men, that there are a lot of men I talk to who I just tell them I'm making this film. And then I say, I know it's about this movement that says that people should have the right to make their own choices about their bodies. And they're like, yeah, that makes sense. And I can see them as a man, like having that moment of like, I've had these feelings a long time and I've never talked to anyone about them because it didn't feel safe. And I didn't know what reaction I get. And like just me mentioning that other people sometimes feel this way gives them permission to actually talk about their feelings.
Yeah, well, that's part of a larger thing that I try to address with my audience, and it's very tricky. It's very difficult to well address today, and these notions around, because we are living in a time where the patriarchy is being confronted. The old order is really being put into question. There's an ever increasingly vocal backlash against what's commonly referred to today as toxic masculinity and male dominance and things that women have put up with and dealt with, etc., for generations and generations, that there's not much space in our society right now for men as victims.
Right, yeah, because the narrative that exists is basically that sexual abuse is something that men do to women, and that men are the perpetrators and women are the victims. And so people are reluctant to see ways in which men might have also experienced victimhood. And I think it's really, it's a counterproductive narrative, because what I think women are asking for from men is greater sensitivity to their boundaries and feelings. And so if you want greater sensitivity from men, then
don't cut off the most sensitive part of their bodies.
Right, and don't attack them when they're being sensitive to their own feelings and emotions. So it's like, I want you to be more sensitive. It's like, okay, these are the ways I feel hurt. And they're like, you're not allowed to feel hurt. Oh, okay. Well, I guess I'll just not be sensitive. Very good point. There's a greater empathy that is possible. I mean, I think even in the case of this particular issue, the foreskin is the same structure, the same nerve endings as the clitoral hood. And so there's even an analogous thing that happens in the body where, women sometimes complain that men don't understand their bodies and their anatomy and their sexuality, but they're missing the part that would allow them to have the same experience on their bodies.
Yeah, one of the things that I found really fascinating when I was exploring this issue is how the foreskin, especially the inner lining of the foreskin, is in many ways the most feminine part of the male genitalia. And so we're cutting away the most feminine aspect, the softest, the most sensitive, the most fragile, and yes, the most pleasurable components, the pinkest, softest parts.
Right. And if you go back, by the way, to tribal societies and their symbolism around this, I believe it's the Dogon tribe, one of the earliest mythic accounts of circumcision. What they will say is that the foreskin represents the feminine in the man. It is wet, it is receiving. And the clitoris represents the masculine in the woman. It is essentially, it's a glans. It is like the head of the penis. And so what their belief was, they would circumcise both men and women. And they would do it because they thought that gender was something you created, that people are basically have both elements. And so you had to remove the feminine from the man and the masculine from the woman. And I learned this, by the way, from a woman who I interviewed in the film, who is circumcised. She comes from a traditional African culture.
Right.
No, actually, this is Foreskin.
Oh. She was a pro-circumcision or a pro-female circumcision voice.
Yes. And her attitude is like, I chose this. You know, she actually went back to her traditional African culture when she was 21, I believe, and chose to have this done. And she's also an anthropologist and really knows a lot about the symbolism. And she's the one who sort of told me about this sort of symbolic element. And she said that one of the reasons she thought that Western culture, American culture, was really against female circumcision and not so much against male circumcision was because women in the West have fought really hard for the right to play the masculine role. This idea, anything a man can do, a woman can do. You know, telling a woman to go back to her feminine role is like one of the most offensive things you can do. And so the idea of removing the masculine element from women is like the most awful thing you can do. But the flip side of that is that we don't really value the feminine in men. You know, if you tell a woman...
This is really fascinating. Thank you. Like, I love the fact that I'm learning new things in this interview as well. Please.
Well, if you tell a woman, like, go back to the kitchen, that's like the most offensive thing you can say. If you tell a man, go back to work, like, well, of course, that's just what we tell men, right? But we don't actually see that there is, like, we don't really value the feminine element in men, and we basically feel like that they don't need it. And so we have this weird thing that's going on in our culture now where we see masculinity as toxic or bad and a perpetrator in some way. So that's not okay. You can't be super masculine. But we also don't think the feminine is good either. And so we need to get rid of that. And so men are in this place where it's like, I don't know what you want. You know, because both elements aren't okay in men.
So I think that's really fascinating. I'd really love to see more of my audience, particularly those who have an audience of themselves, find a way of, you know, really taking on this issue, because it does seem so intrinsically tied up in these other areas that I don't know, my industry is addressing and speaking to so much. Whether you're a man who works with men, or you're doing men's work yourself, this strikes me as very clearly a core men's issue. And whether you're a woman or you work with women, the very things that women are most clamoring for today. Yeah, this seems like it's very much tied up in. You're right. A huge foundational piece is this call for men to be more sensitive to the needs, wants, desires of women, to their boundaries, to their voice, to be able to receive them, and arguably circumcision cuts into our ability to do all those things. Clearly, it's still possible. I'm circumcised, and I'm pretty decent at those things, but it would seem that we would want to get rid of whatever barriers that to that greater sensitivity that we can.
Absolutely. I mean, we actually even haven't gotten into yet the whole, you know, the sexual, like there is a change in sexual mechanics as well, because you had put that question to your audience earlier of, you know, is there a difference? One of the things we talk about in the film is that the foreskin, you know, the penis is actually meant to have moving parts. This is something most people don't know. And so the penis glides in and out of the foreskin. And so the man is actually...
Let's slow it down for a moment, because that would have blown my mind before I started looking into this issue. Because as I understood it at the time, my cock and penises in general or these like dowel rods with a mushroom head on it, you know?
Right.
They're solid and they do this.
I mean, depending on how much you have left, you can roll that up over the head of the penis. And if you're intact, then that all that exists. You're actually moving in and out of yourself. Without that, you know, to get the same stimulation, because with this, you're stimulating the inside and outside of the foreskin and the head of the glands at the same time, if you're inside a woman. Without that, then you have to do much longer strokes. So, because you're using friction instead of the gliding motion. And so to do that, you have to do longer strokes, and you have to pull your body away from the woman more, as opposed to doing these short strokes. So the whole mechanics of sex is actually changed when you just remove this.
One of the things I found very, very fascinating about during my grad school research was that one of the complaints that women can often experience with sex is pain or dryness during sex. And circumcision adds to both of these things, because as you described that, well, first of all, the act of penetration itself is different with a circumcised versus an intact penis. With an intact penis, that gliding motion that you described facilitates the act of penetration. Plus, you have the head and the foreskin is this. It's
Right.
moist mucous membrane tissue, which on a circumcised penis, like it was revelation to me that everything forward of my circumcision scar line was mucous membrane tissue, because it was dry and keratinized or calloused over as a
Right.
circumcised man, versus with an intact penis, it's more like the inner labia or the inside of a woman's vagina. So it's moisture meeting moisture, like kissing, you know, like if one of you had your tongue out for every day of your life and then you tried kissing that person, that would be a little weird kiss.
Yeah, I mean, you actually, I think in your post, you talk about testing this yourself, because if you just cover that part of the body consistently for 2 weeks, you'll start to feel that mucosal quality come back. And among men who restore, this is one of the things that they get back. So, you know, when someone is circumcised, there's fine touch nerve endings in the foreskin, and in particular the ridged band of the foreskin, that are gone. But you can stretch the remaining skin over time to have a covering, in which case you do get back the gliding motion, and you also get back the sensitivity in the head of the penis because it's covered again. It's not dry. I mean, you know, if you're not averse to looking at such things, you can actually go online and see, like, the circumcised penis is very dry. It does not have natural lubrication, because, you know, it'd be like if you stuck your tongue out for a week straight, like it would be less wet. And the intact penis has natural lubrication that occurs. And it's funny because people will try to like demonize that and make it bad, but then also America is the largest market in the world for personal lubricants. Like, in nature, you don't need to go buy a lube at CVS to have sex. That doesn't make any sense. And the second largest market in the world for personal lubricants is Israel, which kind of interesting that it's also the two countries that practice circumcision.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, so among intact men, you don't necessarily need, like, intact men are producing their own lubrication, so it's not just on the woman to be wet or for them to use a lube of some kind. There's actually both partners producing lubrication.
Yeah, again, very, very fascinating, and circumcised America has normalized circumcised penises and circumcised sex to such a degree that, I mean, I would guess that most people would never consider the things that you're just sharing right there.
Because it's just like, that's what my experience is. And so, you know, it's almost like, at one point in my life, I had a bit of a curve in the spine, and it caused me pain. And then I went to a chiropractor and got that worked on. And, you know, it's almost like if you've had something your whole life, you don't have the awareness necessarily to know that it could be different. It's just what your reality is. Totally. And I think that most healing processes involve becoming aware of something like that. There are people who are like, well, that's always what my parents told me, and I didn't know there was another way of believing. Or like, that's just always how my partner treated me. I didn't know there was another way you could have a relationship. And bringing that awareness to something and being willing to feel the pain of how your reality is necessary for any healing to feel the opposite of that.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. So Stephanie Quain asked a good question. She said, was there anything you learned during the making of the film that really surprised you?
I mean, I think it's all going to be surprises to someone. It's hard for me to answer that because there were things I was aware of, and then I would talk to someone and hear the personal story about it. And it's different reading something in a book than it is hearing someone tell their own lived experience. So there was an emotional surprise in talking to people. I think the fact that the AAP's current position is more moderate and has moderated. When you talk, I interviewed 2 different people from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and one did the policy statement in the 80s. He's literally written poetry about circumcision. He thinks it's so great. And the one I talked to for the latest policy statement basically says it's just a cultural custom. That's really the only reason it's still done. As far as other, yeah, I mean, I did not. I'm surprised that he could acknowledge that and then still have the policy statement they did. And so that makes me, I think also, like, when these policy statements are done, they're made by committee. And so there's some people on the committee who are vehemently for it and some who are less for it. Yeah. Even within these organizations, there's often disagreement. And even within, like, when you hear an organization that's putting out a statement like that, when you actually get into it, there's 1 or 2 people involved who are really pushing it through. And people assume that this is like a vetted scientific committee, not a trade organization with 1 or 2 radical members within it.
Fascinating. Jordan Arrell said, so how can we reclaim our masculinity, including gentleness, and other healing processes?
That's a longer question that might even be its own podcast or film.
Well, if you do that film, I'd like to be a part of it.
Absolutely. I think the process to heal anything is first becoming aware of it and being present with whatever feelings are there.
Agreed.
So if there's anger, be present with that. If there's hurt, be present with that. If there's grief, even if there's resistance, if there's a part of you that's like, I don't think any of this is true, I think I'm fine. I think that people who are talking about this are weak in some way and they're wrong and I don't like them, be present with that feeling. That would be the first step. And then once you're present with it, there are a million different healing methods you could go down. And I imagine that your audience, every single person in the group has a particular method that they might use. I feel like
I'm going to speak to that real quick because this is kind of my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So a couple years ago, somebody who actually ran up one of the Students for General Integrity chapters on a different campus, that was an organization that I started while in grad school, reached out to me, found me through Facebook and was like, hey, I've something like, I really admire like the work that you're putting out there. How do you do it? Like, how do you not just be depressed about about this having been done to you and, what was taken away? And the answer that I ended up coming to present to him, because I mean, clearly he's asking, how do I not, for himself, how does he not just be in that depression around it. I'm like, well, especially while speaking about it and fighting for this change, I believe you need to be doing something for yourself, like be in active exploration of your own sexuality. Because while I may have had a sizable part of my genitalia amputated and forever gone, and there are things that I will never know and never experience, which quite frankly does piss me off. At the same time, I can have multiple non-ejaculatory energetic orgasms and full body orgasms that move through my entire body. I can experience subtle energetic sex in ways that our culture doesn't even speak of as being possible. I've explored kink and BDSM. I've explored the primal animalistic aspects of my sexuality. I've explored various aspects of gender expression. I've explored, I mean, you name it, I've explored it. Maybe there's a connection between the two. I don't know. What I can say, though, is that our sexuality is so enormous. The capacity is so enormous. You can be in active exploration of what am I capable of, and spend your entire life discovering new things and discovering new things within your body that most people will never know regardless. So you can have that as a larger focal point while still helping, address that, and this is fucked up and wrong and we need to stop it.
You know what's interesting is that the method of exploration you're talking about to go into the positive is the same method of exploration you'd use to go into the negative. The same way that you're fully present with a part of yourself that feels grief or sadness, you can be fully present with a part of yourself that feels joy and ecstasy.
Very well said. Very well said. And so one of the methods that I teach my men, especially those who I'm working with around sexual self-mastery, is what I call erotic self-exploration practice. So almost every man has some masturbation habits, and they're usually very habit-oriented, and often, eyes are on a screen and hands going up and down. And they come and then go on with their day, but whatever it ends up looking like, versus an erotic self-exploration practice being about being present with your body, not focused here, but in here, tuning into subtleties in your body, noticing what's happening in your body, being in a full exploration of your entire body as a foundational piece of getting to know this and what it's capable of. And it really is a masturbation as meditation. So being present with what is, and that process often brings up a lot of emotion for a man, especially in the beginning.
I will say that I feel like learning about this issue has actually improved my sex life, because before, I think this is the awareness that a lot of men have, is like, it feels good on my penis, which is kind of like, it's a sort of generalized feeling, as opposed to knowing what the sensation is above the scar line or on the frenulum, or feeling what each individual, like, because the penis does have individual parts, and knowing like this is what each individual piece is feeling. And that practice can be extended to every other part of the body and every other feeling you might have during sexuality.
Yeah, very, very well said. So, we're nearly an hour and a half in. Well, is there any last major messages you'd like to leave our audience with?
I feel like learning about this issue and watching a film like the one I've created is not the end of a process, but the start of one. Because once you start exploring this, then there are other things it opens up. It opens up your conception of masculinity, of sexuality, of how we treat children, of the relationship between parent and child, of the medical industry, even of how the media reports certain things. And so I feel like this issue can be a catalyst for a lot of other positive changes and a greater awareness. So my invitation to your audience would be to let yourself continue to explore it and be present with whatever feelings come up, because this is certainly an issue that brings up every type of feeling you might imagine.
Yeah, wonderful. And where can I find your film?
The film, you can find it on circumcisionmovie.com. We are on Amazon and iTunes and all the places you buy films.
Yeah. So if you watched this far, you clearly have enough interest. Watch the movie, get the movie. It's there's a number of things that we touched upon here that just get to be gone into at a much deeper level, as well as with a wide variety of professionals and extremely well-educated activists as well, who are able to give you all the details that some of which we were able to get into here, and many of which we didn't. You'll also learn more about foreskin restoration, what that really means, as well as some of the methods to do so. Something that if we had more time, we would love to also dive further into. Connect with Brendon here on Facebook. Any other social media you'd like to point them to?
You can find all the film social media at CircMovie on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And you can find me at BD Marotta, which is my last name, and at BrendonMarotta.com.
Yeah, wonderful. There are a lot of questions and comments in here. I really invite you to kind of come back in when you have a chance and respond to many of them. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. This is clearly a very lively and charged topic, one that quite obviously I have a lot of very strong opinions about as well. I believe that this needs to end, and preferably within this generation. If there is a time, the time is now. Please help me be a part of it. Help share this live stream. Help share about the film itself. Speak to other people in your life. If you're still not quite sure where you are in it, speak to people in your life. I think a huge part of this is to just be having the conversation. Again, much like our Me Too movement and other things, if we really get this conversation really going, we're going to see changes regardless. So engage with me, engage with Brendon, engage with people in your community. Thank you all. Please join us again next Tuesday for the Evolve Masculine Tuesdays live stream every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern. Always a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brendon.
Thank you.